Okay, here we go again. Um, in the last video that you've just seen, of course, I said that I would now try to explain some of the ingredients that you find in your commercial breads. Not just to like slag off the competition, but you know, bread's interesting, and of course you're interested too. So this will help us understand a bit more about what's going on there. Okay, so imagine that you're uh, a process engineer or a manager for a commercial bread process, and you want to do the best job that you can, getting a lot of bread out there for the right price. So what are the parameters that you need to take to pay attention to? Okay, well, you need continuous throughput because you have invested a lot of money in this production plant, right? And this machinery has to be operating to be profitable. Of course, you need it to be fairly cheap. You want it to also be very consistent so that when you put a loaf of bread into a package with a certain label on it, the consumer can always, forever after, expect that it will be identical, right? Because this is something we really value as consumers, is consistency. And you also want that loaf to achieve a really good rise, because people don't buy bread based on the weight of the loaf, they buy it on the size, whereas what you've put in is an amount of dough, which is what you paid for, right? So you want the smallest possible piece of dough to make the largest possible piece of bread. Okay, so this is what you're looking at. Okay, so how do we make this happen? Well, let me first of all introduce you to gluten, because gluten is really important to this whole process. Okay, this is dough. and as I sort of pull it apart, you can see this is the gluten test. Okay, and you don't get this just by adding water to flour. You have to mix it because the gluten, it's called develops. And this gluten develops through mixing, really. And if this looks to you like the skin on a balloon, that's exactly the function that it has in your bread. So here's how it works. The yeast, which is the active living thing in the dough, eats carbs. And as it eats carbs, it breathes out CO2. Just like you breathe in oxygen, you breathe out CO2. That's what the yeast is doing in the bread. And as it breathes out the CO2, if there weren't any gluten, that CO2 would just like diffuse its way to the edge of the bread and then just disappear out into the atmosphere. But because of the gluten that is holding onto it like a balloon, it's staying in there and it's inflating your bread. Okay, which is really quite essential. Okay, so the carbs that it eats, the starches in the flour, are completely suitable carbs for yeast. It's just that starches are big, long chain carbs, and it would take a while to break them down, which is why, in traditionally bread had to sit around on the table for quite a long time. But we can subvert this industrially by adding sugar, which is why when you look in commercial breads, there's sugar. Because the yeast goes, oh wow, nice simple carb, and just like eats it quickly, and then inflates your bread quite fast. Also, the sugar browns on the outside of the loaf and gives you that caramelized look, so that you can actually bake your bread fairly quickly. Your grocery store bread is actually kind of underbaked, but it's got that brown on it from the sugar. There's also going to be fat in the process, because the fats and oils help that dough move through the machinery without tearing as much, because the gluten's kind of tight, right? And you don't want to give it time to relax because you want to keep your process going. The fat helps it move through there more readily. Also, we expect that bread should go in our freezers for some reason. I'll talk about that in another video. But we like bread that we can freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw and freeze and thaw, and the fat helps that process go along. Okay, so here's a loaf. Remain nameless. I just bought this at Superstore for it was about $1.50. So let's just look at some of the things we got in there and try to explain them. Okay, so we've got enriched wheat flour. Of course, you got to have flour. And then water and yeast, all makes sense. And then sugar. Okay, well, now there's the sugar. It's just so that the yeast has something to attack very quickly and get that whole exhalation process going much faster and inflate the bread more quickly so it gets into the oven faster, right? All right. Soybean and or canola oil. There's the oils, which will help it freeze thaw better and also help it move through the process better. Gluten. Hey, it actually added wheat gluten. Well, why not, right? because that is actually what's going to, I mean, why would you need to add gluten to flour anyway, right? So you're going to add more gluten just so you can get more of a rise out of the thing, right? Salt, some more soy flour. I don't know why all the soy flour is in there. Calcium propionate is a preservative. It's antibacterial, antifungal, gives it a longer shelf life. Sodium stearoyl 2-lactylate, may not have pronounced that correctly. That is a multifunctional chemical. It helps fat dissolve in water more. It kind of helps, unpack the gluten to give it a bigger dispersion throughout the dough. And actually, if you go look at the Wikipedia page, it has this picture of a loaf of bread that's only this high without this sodium stearoyl 2-lactate, and then this one where you've actually added it. So it helps baked products attain a higher volume, right? Which clearly adds to their value. Which one are you going to take? A loaf of bread that's this big or this big if they're the same price, right? Vegetable monoglycerides, just another form of fat. Datem, acetylated tartaric acid esters, and mono and diglycerides. These things also sort of surround the gluten and make it just achieve a better network to hold on to more air. Azodicarbonamide is an antifungal agent to improve shelf life. Ascorbic acid adjusts the pH just so that you've got a more effective thing for the yeast to do their thing, more effective pH environment for the yeast to do their thing. Enzymes, these enzymes will continue working in the bread 5 to 10 days after it has been baked to keep breaking it down to keep it softer, so that the longer it's been out of the oven, these enzymes will kind of keep chewing it up so that it will stay soft. Because that's how people buy bread, right? You don't check the date. What you do is you go, oh, soft, must be fresh. And may contain sesame. Okay, that's a look at grocery store bread.